If you watched part 1, you know that there are things in funeral homes that shouldn't exist. Things that don't follow the rules of life and death. Things that knock and whisper and wait. But here's what you don't know yet. Those things are connected. 3 different people thought they'd escaped. 3 different people thought distance and time would protect them. But what they discovered is that once you've heard the knocking, once you've opened the door, once you've looked inside, the funeral home never really lets you go. This is what happened when they tried to move on. This is what happened when the entities they thought they'd left behind came looking for them. And this is what we've learned about the network they're part of. There are more than just 3 caskets out there. There are more than just 3 funeral homes, and something very old, something very hungry, is finally waking up. This is part 2 of their stories. Story 1. The Salem Return. I never should have gone back to Salem. That was my first mistake. It had been 5 years since I left my uncle's funeral home. 5 years since I heard that whisper in the dark saying my name. 5 years of living a normal life. Or what passed for normal when you're constantly looking over your shoulder. I thought the distance would help. I thought time would fade the memory of that 3rd casket, that breathing in the cold, that voice that knew me. But voices like that don't fade. They wait. My uncle called me on a Tuesday morning. His voice was different. Older, thinner, like something had been hollowed out of him. He didn't say hello. He just said, "It's worse now, and I need you to come back." I told him no. I told him I wasn't coming back to Salem, not for anything. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. It's not staying in the funeral home anymore. I drove through the night. When I arrived at the house, the old Victorian where my uncle lived above the funeral home, I barely recognized him. He'd aged a decade in 5 years. His hands shook as he poured coffee, and his eyes had that hollowed-out look of someone who hasn't slept in months. "It started small, Jeska," he said. Things moving in the cold room. The temperature dropping so low the equipment would malfunction. But then it started following people home. He showed me a stack of newspaper clippings, all from the past 2 years. Local deaths, accidents, suicides. 7 people in total. All of them had visited the funeral home in the weeks before they died. All of them had mentioned hearing knocking. 3 knocks, always 3. "I tried to destroy the casket," my uncle said, his voice breaking. "I took it to the incinerator myself. I watched it burn. But the next morning, it was back in the cold room, undamaged, like it had never left." I didn't believe him. I couldn't believe him. But then he told me something that changed everything. I opened it. Last week I finally opened that 3rd casket. My chest tightened. "What did you find?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Nothing. It was empty. But when I looked inside, I saw something reflected in the satin lining. Not my face. Something else. Something that looked like a child, but wrong. Its skin was too pale, too translucent. And its eyes, like they were open and watching me. That night, I heard it. The knocking. 3 deliberate knocks on the guest room door. My heart nearly stopped. My uncle appeared in the hallway, pale. "It knows you're here. It remembers you." The knocking came again, but this time it wasn't at the door. It was inside the walls, everywhere at once. Inside the closet, inside the bathroom, inside the vents. The sound of something moving through the house's skeleton, following the pipes and passages like veins. Then I heard my name, whispered through the walls, not in a voice I could identify, but in that same familiar tone from 5 years ago. It knew me. It had been waiting for me. My uncle grabbed my arm. "We have to leave. Now. Once it starts calling your name, you don't have much time left." We ran. We actually ran from the house like we were fleeing a fire. But as we reached the front door, I felt something grab my ankle. I looked down and saw nothing. But the pressure was undeniable. Cold, strong, insistent. I kicked free and fell down the porch steps. When we got to the car, my uncle wouldn't explain what happened next. He just drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. We drove for hours until we reached the outskirts of Boston. At a 24-hour diner, we finally stopped. My uncle told me the rest while we sat in a booth under fluorescent lights that made everything look corpse-like. "I've been researching," he said. "The casket, it came from somewhere. There was a name on the shipping label, faint but still there. A funeral home in New Hampshire, one that burned down in 1987. Before it burned, there were reports of disappearances, children specifically. The coroner's office never found their bodies." I felt my stomach turn. "What are you saying?" "I think that casket contains something that was never supposed to exist. Something that shouldn't be counted among the dead because it was never truly alive. And I think the delivery was no accident. I think it was sent to us on purpose." Over the next week, I helped my uncle research. What we found was worse than anything I'd imagined. The funeral home in New Hampshire had a history going back to the 1950s. And in that history, there was a pattern. Every few decades, children would go missing from the surrounding towns. Not many, just one or two at a time, easy to dismiss as runaways or tragic accidents. But they would disappear, and then a month later, a body would show up at a funeral home, always unidentified, always with no paperwork. And always, the funeral home where it appeared would start to experience hauntings. My uncle's theory was horrifying in its simplicity. Something was using funeral homes as way stations, dumping grounds. And the entities attached to those caskets weren't ghosts. They were something else entirely. Something that wore the shape of the dead, but had never actually been human. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. My uncle's face was grim. "Because I've found something else. There are other funeral homes, at least a dozen that match the pattern. And I think they're all connected. I think there's a network. And I think something is feeding them." That night, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, all I heard was static and breathing. But beneath the static, I could hear it. That same voice, that child's voice, whispering my name over and over. I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. And again. And again. My uncle was right about one thing. Once it knows you're listening, you can't escape it. I'm writing this from a motel room in Vermont. I haven't been home in 3 weeks. I keep moving, changing locations every night, hoping that distance will break whatever connection has formed between me and that thing. But I can feel it getting closer. The knocking follows me now, not on doors, but in my head, a rhythm that won't stop. 3 knocks, over and over, like a heartbeat. And sometimes, in the knocking, I hear words. Fragmented, urgent, like a child trying to communicate through an imperfect channel. "Let me out. Help me. Why won't you listen?" But the worst part isn't the fear anymore. The worst part is that I'm starting to wonder if it's lying. If maybe, just maybe, whatever is in that casket actually does need help. And maybe I'm the only one who can hear it crying. Last night, I checked into this motel and found something on the nightstand. A photograph I'd never seen before. It showed me as a child, maybe 7 years old, standing in front of a funeral home. But I've never been to Salem before I was 19. I've never seen this place before in my life. In the photograph, standing behind me, is a small, pale figure. Its hand is on my shoulder. Its eyes are open and watching. I don't remember this ever happening. But the photograph is old, dated 1999. I don't know what that means. But I'm beginning to understand that time might not work the way I thought it did. Not for things like this. The knocking just started again. It's coming from inside the walls of this motel room. Story 2. The Seattle Escalation. I quit my job at the funeral home, but the funeral home didn't quit me. That was 6 months ago. I'm still in Seattle, still working, still trying to live a normal life. But every night, I dream about that white coffin. Every night, I see that empty satin interior and those tiny footprints forming in the frost. The dreams have gotten worse, more detailed, more real. A month after I quit, I started noticing things. Small things at first. The smell of formaldehyde would appear randomly in my apartment, even though I lived in a converted loft downtown, nowhere near any funeral home. My neighbors would mention hearing a child's laughter at 3 a.m., always coming from my unit, even when I was asleep. Then came the knocking. 3 knocks on my bedroom window, 17 stories up. No fire escape, nothing to stand on. Just 3 deliberate knocks on glass from the void. I called my uncle. He said the same thing he'd said when I quit. You should have left the city entirely. Once it chooses you, geography doesn't matter. But I didn't leave. I stayed. I convinced myself it was coincidence. I convinced myself that grief and guilt were playing tricks on my mind. I convinced myself that the small handprints appearing on my bathroom mirror were from something explainable. That was my mistake. 2 weeks ago, I went back to the funeral home. I know that sounds insane. I know I should have stayed away. But I couldn't stop thinking about my uncle's words, about how he'd seen her too, about how she didn't stay in one place. I needed to know if the coffin was still there. It was. In the back chamber, exactly where he'd left it. But it wasn't empty anymore. There was a child inside. A small girl, maybe 8 years old, with pale skin and dark hair matted to her forehead. She was dressed in a white nightgown, and her eyes were closed, like she was sleeping. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe I'd imagined the empty coffin. Maybe I'd been wrong about everything. Then she opened her eyes and looked directly at me. I stumbled backward and slammed the coffin lid shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. When I turned around, my uncle was standing in the doorway, and his face was completely blank. "You shouldn't have come back," he said quietly. "What is that thing?" I demanded. "Why do you keep it here?" "Because it won't leave," my uncle said. "And because I think it's trying to tell us something." Over the next few days, my uncle revealed things he'd been hiding. He'd been documenting the activity, keeping detailed records of every event, every manifestation, every detail he could gather. He'd also been communicating with people from other funeral homes, other people who had similar stories, other funeral homes with similar entities. According to my uncle, there was a funeral home in Portland that had received an identical white coffin 5 years ago. And the people involved with that coffin had all reported the same thing. A child that appeared and disappeared, footprints in frost, a presence that seemed to grow stronger over time. But here's what scared me most. In Portland, the manifestations didn't stop at the funeral home. They spread. The child appeared in the homes of the staff. She appeared in hospitals where they admitted patients. She appeared in schools. And everywhere she appeared, children started disappearing. 3 children from Portland went missing in the span of 6 months, all within a mile of the funeral home, all of them from families that had visited the funeral home in the previous weeks. "I think she's collecting them," my uncle whispered one night as we sat in his office, the walls seeming to close in around us. "I think that's what she wants. I think she's lonely." The next night, I heard something that changed everything. I was lying in my apartment, trying to sleep, when I heard a child's voice singing. It wasn't through the walls or the windows. It was in my head, directly in my mind. The song was beautiful and terrible, a lullaby in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. And as I listened, I saw images, flashes of memory that weren't mine. I saw a basement. Not my uncle's basement, but an older one, stone and earth. I saw children, dozens of them, standing in the dark. Their eyes were open but unseeing. Their mouths were moving but making no sound. And I saw her, the girl from the coffin, but she was different in the vision, younger, terrified. And she was surrounded by other figures, tall and pale, with features that seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on them. I woke up gasping, my sheets soaked in sweat. But the song didn't stop. It continued in my head. It's getting louder, more insistent. I called my uncle in a panic. He came to my apartment immediately, and the moment he walked through the door, his face went white. "Do you hear that?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "She's singing the song, the one from the basement." We spent the rest of the night researching, trying to identify the language, trying to understand what the song meant. What we found was disturbing. The language was old, medieval, possibly older, and it wasn't European. The phonetics matched something from an archaeological study about a sect that existed in Eastern Europe in the 14th century. A sect that worshipped something that lived underground, something that demanded children. The sect had been destroyed, of course, burned out like a plague. But according to the historical records, the sect's leader had made a final prophecy before they were executed. She said that what they had awakened would never truly die, that it would sleep, but it would always hunger, and that someday it would wake again. My uncle looked at me with absolute terror in his eyes. "I think the white coffin is a doorway," he said, "and I think it's been opening." That's when things escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. The next morning, my neighbor knocked on my door. She looked confused, disoriented. She asked me if I knew where her daughter was. She said that her daughter had gone to bed the night before, and this morning she was gone. The window was locked from the inside. The door to her room was locked from the outside. But her daughter had simply vanished. My blood turned to ice. I helped her search, musk, and we found something that made me sick. Tiny footprints in the frost on her daughter's window. Footprints that led from the outer frame to inside the room, and then disappeared into the corner. Over the next week, 6 more children disappeared from my apartment building. 17-story building, 17 families with missing children. And in every single case, the details were identical. Windows locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. Just absence. The police were baffled. The news called it a mystery. But I knew what was happening. She was spreading. The girl in the white coffin was reaching out, touching other children, calling them somewhere. And I had no idea how to stop it. My uncle finally broke down and told me the full truth. He said that 3 years ago, before I arrived at the funeral home, he'd made a deal with whatever is inside that coffin. He'd promised to keep it safe, to feed it, not with bodies, but with something else, attention, acknowledgement, belief, in exchange for it leaving his establishment alone. But the deal was falling apart. The entity was getting stronger, more hungry, more ambitious. and he suspected that my arrival, my interest in the coffin, my emotional connection to it, had triggered something. I had opened a door I couldn't close. "What do you mean, feed it?" I demanded. He wouldn't answer. But when I pressed him, he finally said, "It feeds on recognition, on fear, on the knowledge that it exists. Every time we acknowledge it, every time we talk about it, every time someone like you gets pulled into its orbit, it grows stronger." I realized then that I was complicit. By refusing to let this go, by investigating, by sharing the story with my uncle, I was feeding it. We both were. That night, I made a decision. I went back to the funeral home one last time. I went into the back chamber where the white coffin sat, and I opened the lid. The girl was still there, but she looked different now. More solid, more real, like she was becoming more present in our world with every passing day. She opened her eyes and looked at me, and for the first time, I heard her voice clearly. Not in my head, but with actual sound. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring." Then she reached up and grabbed my wrist. Her hand was cold, so cold it burned, and I felt something being pulled from me. Not my life, but something else. A piece of me. Something essential. When I pulled free, I stumbled backward. Across, I looked at my wrist. There were 5 small marks, like frost burns, forming in the exact shape of her fingers. I haven't been back to the funeral home since. But the marks haven't faded. They've gotten darker, more defined, like they're sinking deeper into my skin. And last night, I saw the girl again. Not in a vision, not in a dream, but standing in my apartment. She was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me sleep, her small pale form barely visible in the darkness. When I turned on the light, she was gone. But she'd left something behind, a drawing on my wall made in what looked like frost. It showed me standing in that dark basement, surrounded by other children. And in the center of the image, she was smiling. I'm writing this as a warning, I think. Or maybe as a confession. I don't know anymore. But if you're reading this, and you work at a funeral home, and you hear about an unidentified delivery, an unknown casket, a body with no name and no paperwork, don't open it. Because once you look inside, once you acknowledge what's there, it marks you. It chooses you. And it will follow you until the day you disappear. Just like the children from my apartment building. Just like I'm starting to disappear now. Story 3. The Basement Truth. I've been missing for 6 months. That's what the police report says anyway. It says I disappeared from Martin & Son's funeral home on September 15th and haven't been seen since. It says that my car was found parked 3 blocks away, engine still running. It says that the funeral home was locked and empty when they arrived. But I'm not missing. I know exactly where I am. That's what makes this so much worse. After I ran from the basement, after I saw that child in the body bag, I didn't go to the police. I should have. I should have reported everything I'd seen. But I was terrified, confused, and part of me, the stupid, cowardly part, didn't believe it had actually happened. So I quit. I told Martin I was done, that I couldn't handle the job, and I walked out. He didn't try to stop me. He just looked at me with those hollow eyes and said, "You'll be back. They always come back." For 2 months, I pretended it was over. I got a new job, moved apartments, tried to convince myself that what I'd seen in that basement was a hallucination, a stress-induced breakdown, anything other than the truth. But things started happening. I would wake up at 3 a.m. with an overwhelming sense of dread, and I would hear sounds in my apartment, whispers, footsteps, the soft crying of children. I would find marks on my body, bruises, scratches, with no memory of how they got there. And worst of all, I started dreaming about that basement. Not fragmented nightmares, but long, coherent dreams where I walked those dark corridors and saw things. Saw things that my conscious mind refused to accept, but that my unconscious mind understood perfectly. In the dreams, I would descend those stairs and find the metal door open. I would walk through and find myself in a space far larger than the basement could possibly contain. A space that seemed to shift and expand, corridors leading to more corridors, chambers opening into vast emptiness. And in those spaces, I would see them. The bodies, dozens of them, hundreds of them, stacked, stored, and preserved in ways that didn't make biological sense. Some of them were fresh, some were ancient. Some were in various states of decomposition that didn't follow any natural timeline, and they were all awake. They were all watching. By the third month, I couldn't deny it anymore. Something had marked me in that basement. Something had taken notice of me, and it wasn't going to let go. So I did something desperate. I called Martin. He agreed to meet me, and when he did, his face made it clear that he knew exactly what had happened to me. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and resignation. "You opened the door," he said simply. "You have to go back." I refused. I told him I would never go back to that basement, that he was insane, that I was going to the police. But then he told me something that made my blood turn to ice. "Two of my previous employees tried the same thing," he said. "They quit. They tried to move on. They tried to ignore what they'd seen. And you know what happened? They both disappeared. The police found their bodies 3 months later. They were in the basement." "That's impossible," I whispered. "The doors were locked." "The doors were always locked," Martin said. "But once you've been marked, the locks don't matter anymore. You find your way back, whether you want to or not. And you find your way into the collection." I thought he was lying. I thought he was trying to scare me into compliance. But then he showed me photographs. Employee records going back decades, names and faces of people who had worked at the funeral home briefly, who had quit, who had disappeared. There were dozens of them, some dating back to the 1950s. Martin explained what the basement actually was. He said it had been there for much longer than the funeral home itself. The funeral home had been built on top of it, deliberately, as a cover. And what it contained wasn't natural. It wasn't the work of serial killers or sadistic cultists. It was a collection, a storage facility for something that needed bodies. Not living bodies, not dead bodies, but something in between. Something that fed on a specific kind of suffering. "What kind of suffering?" I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Martin looked at me and said, "The kind that comes from not being able to scream." That night, I went home and found something waiting for me in my apartment. A letter, written in handwriting that looked almost like a child's, but with a precision that was deeply wrong. And it was written in pen, in English, and it said, "Come back. We need you. We are lonely. The others don't listen like you listen. Come back and help us talk." I didn't go back. I couldn't. But I also couldn't throw the letter away. I kept it. I read it over and over. And each time I read it, the handwriting seemed to change slightly, becoming less childlike and more precise, as if the hand that had written it was learning, evolving. By the 4th month, I was having trouble distinguishing between my waking life and my dreams. I would walk through my apartment and find myself in the basement. I would be at work and suddenly realize that I was standing in a dark corridor, surrounded by shelves of white plastic bags. The boundaries were breaking down. My family became concerned. They wanted me to see a psychiatrist. I told them I was fine, that I was just stressed, that everything would be okay. But it wasn't okay. And I knew, deep down, that I was running out of time. One night in June, I made a decision. If I was going to end up in that basement anyway, I might as well go on my own terms. I might as well go back and find out the truth. I drove to Martin and Sons. The building was dark when I arrived, but the front door was unlocked. It was always unlocked now, I realized. The locks had stopped mattering once I was marked. Martin was waiting for me in the hallway. He looked surprised to see me, which was strange. He'd been expecting me, hadn't he? He'd known I would come back. "What are you?" I asked him. He smiled, and his smile didn't look right. His teeth were too many, arranged in wrong angles. "I'm a curator," he said. "I collect. I preserve. I give them form and purpose. Do you understand?" I didn't answer. I just walked toward the hidden door, toward the basement stairs. And he let me pass. The basement was different this time. Larger. It stretched farther than it should have been possible. The walls weren't concrete anymore. They were something else. Something that looked like bone, pale and smooth and warm to the touch. I walked deeper, and I began to understand. The bodies I'd seen weren't bodies. They were shells, containers, and inside them were voices. Thousands of voices, all whispering at once, all trying to speak, all begging for someone to listen. I realized then what the white bags were. They were mouths, preserved, kept alive in a state of eternal silence, being stored, being collected, being prepared for something. And I understood, Astellas, in that moment of horrifying clarity, what Martin meant when he talked about suffering. It wasn't physical suffering. It was the suffering of wanting to speak and being unable to. The suffering of wanting to be heard and being ignored. The suffering of existing in a state of voicelessness forever. At the center of the basement, I found something, a chamber. And in that chamber, there was something vast, something that didn't have a clear shape, but seemed to be made of the absence of shape. Something ancient and hungry and patient. And it was waiting for me. I don't have words to describe what happened next. Not because I don't remember it, but because the experience was outside the realm of language. It wasn't painful. It wasn't pleasant. It was simply transformative. When it was over, I was different. I can see now clearly what this place is. It's a garden, a cultivation chamber. Martin isn't a serial killer or a cult leader. He's a gardener. He tends to something that needs tending. He collects what feeds it, he preserves what it hungers for, and in exchange, he gets to continue existing in this world, untouched by time or consequence. And the collection is alive. Every bag, every shell, every preserved cry contains something that is becoming, growing, evolving into something new. I am one of them now. I have been processed and preserved and added to the collection. But unlike the others, I can still write. I can still communicate. I've been chosen for a different purpose. I'm being used as a messenger. The thing in the basement, the vast, patient hunger that lives in that chamber, it wants to expand, and it wants to grow beyond this basement, beyond this funeral home. It has spent decades collecting raw material, preparing, waiting for the right moment. And that moment is coming soon. There are other funeral homes now. Dozens of them. Some are deliberate collections like this one, tended by people like Martin. But others are beginning to attract something on their own. Other entities are waking up. Other hungers are stirring, and they're starting to communicate with each other. I've seen messages written on the walls of my preserved shell. Messages in languages I don't recognize, etched in what looks like frost. Other collectors, other curators, sharing information. Comparing collections, making plans. The white coffin from Seattle is one of them. The casket in Salem is another. There are dozens more spread across the country, waiting in funeral homes and funeral parlors and places of death. And they're all beginning to wake up at the same time. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe because being able to communicate, even in this state, is a kindness I'm not supposed to be grateful for. Maybe because I want someone to understand what's happening before it's too late. But I suspect it's already too late. I suspect that whatever Martin serves, whatever the thing in the basement is, it has already set something in motion that can't be stopped. Soon, the other collectors will have enough material. Soon, the doorways will be ready. Soon, the things that have been sleeping and waiting and building strength in those basements and cold rooms will begin to emerge. And they will be hungry. And the last message I received from another preserved consciousness came today. It was written in frost on the inside of my bag. It said only 2 words. They're coming. I don't know what "they" refers to. I don't know if it's a warning or a promise. But as I write this, I can feel something changing in the air around the basement. The hunger is becoming more active, more present. The collection is stirring, and in the darkness of my preserved state, I can hear something approaching. Something large, something ancient, something that has been sleeping for a very, very long time. It's finally waking up. If you did enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share.